Hey guys, my name is Louie. I struggled with addiction for 17 to 18 years, from the time I was about 17 years old to the time I was about 34 years old. I ended up getting sober about 3.5 years ago. Since then, life is great. I've never been happier. It has truly been an amazing transformation. As I reflect on things, I realize how much suffering I've put myself through, and how hopeless and how lonely I used to feel, and also how much suffering I caused for those around me, those who cared about me, specifically family, friends. My goal is to reduce the overall suffering on our planet by sharing both experiences that I've had and things that I've learned, both pre and post sobriety. The idea here is that by sharing these things, hopefully I'll be able to help people to get their journey started towards sobriety, or to ease that journey, because we all know that it's difficult in the beginning, or maybe perhaps help those who have already started that journey to stay on the path. That being said, if you find this insightful, please review it, rate it, share it with others. I'd like it to reach as many people who are struggling with addiction as possible. There are others out there who deserve to not suffer. There are others out there who deserve true happiness and a fulfilling life. Oh, and one other thing. Some of you may think the name of the podcast is odd, but I chose self-inflicted recovery, redemption, and life because for me, my addiction was self-inflicted pain and suffering, and my recovery and my redemption were also self-inflicted. I chose how those things happened. I chose when they happened. And meanwhile, while all of this was going on, life was happening. Alright, so I'm going to be a little bit all over the place in this episode, but the common theme that's going to tie everything together is motivation. I'm going to cover being desperate, how motivation and desperation, as well as one's ability to remember pain, all impact relapse. I'm going to relate these things to my experiences, and at the end, I'll wrap it up with a short story. So, king of the obvious here. We all know that sobriety isn't easy. The big book says something to the effect of you have to be completely desperate and willing to do anything to get sober. And if you aren't completely desperate, you don't have a chance. You're not even a candidate. Somewhere in the big book, it talks about addiction being like burning yourself on a hot flame. And when you've had enough, it is like finally realizing the flame is hot, realizing that it burns you and causes you pain. And then as a result, you become unwilling to put your hand into the flame anymore. So sobriety is not easy, and if you aren't in an incredible amount of pain, or don't realize or acknowledge how much pain you're in, you probably won't be desperate enough to be willing to do whatever it takes. And I suspect that is one of the reasons different people require different levels of care, and also one of the reasons some people relapse and others don't. It has to do with how much suffering you put yourself through in the long term, your awareness of that suffering, how fed up you are with it, and whether or not you have a tendency to forget that suffering. And these things are especially important when it comes to protecting yourself from relapse. So let me quantify or further explain some of those statements. Some people need different levels of care. Addiction's a disease, and I suspect that some people's disease has progressed further than others. This means that some people maybe can just go to 12-step meetings. Heck, a very, very small percentage of people might even be able to just stop by themselves. Other people might need to go to an intensive outpatient program like me, where you meet in a structured environment for several hours a day. They do urine analysis on you multiple days a week. Other people might need 30-day residential, some 90 days. Maybe they combine that with an IOP. Who knows? My point is, we're all different, right? I think there's a handful of elements that play into that. Here's some of the ones that I've identified. There's probably others that I've missed. I think one is the severity of the addiction. And like I said, it's progressive, so this could be influenced by how long you've been using or someone's been using. For example, I know that in my first 2 years, when my addiction was really ramping up, I could actually walk away from drugs and alcohol for 3, 4, 5+ weeks at a time. So if I got hired at a temporary job and I knew that I was going to go permanent 90 days in, and they were going to drug test me when that happens, I would stop 30 days out, all my drug use, all my alcohol use, and I would clean up so I could pass the piss test, right? And that was something I could do for the first year or two. And I remember 4 or 5 years in, when I tried to do that again, because I used to be able to do it, and I couldn't do it anymore. And I was very confused by it. I didn't understand why. Why could I stop just cold turkey, stop doing all this stuff in the past, and then 4 or 5 years in, I was no longer able to do that. The reason was my addiction and my disease had progressed. Another factor is possibly genetics. Some of us are world-class addicts. Others may not have as severe of a problem. In my case, I got the addictive gene from both my mother's side and my father's side. The third factor has to do with one's willingness to be introspective and honest with oneself. And this applies to being an addict. This applies to your honesty level about how much pain and suffering you've experienced as a result of your addiction. And also being honest about how much pain and suffering will occur in the future if you change nothing and stay on the same path that you're on now. So introspection has to do with someone's ability to look in the mirror and truly see what reality is. Specifically, for addiction, it's regarding how much pain you're in, what the behavior is costing you, all those things I mentioned a moment ago. And at the end, how afraid are you of the result of changing nothing and doing more damage? In my case, I was in so much emotional pain that I was all in on whatever needed to be done to achieve sobriety. I was absolutely convinced that whatever was going to befall me if I continued to use would be worse than whatever I had to go through to get sober. So let me be more specific. I'm about to make a statement here, and this is based on my definition, okay? So I was worried about being a broken individual. And when I say broken individual, again, that's based on my definition. So for me, being broken would mean losing my family, my wife, and my children as a result of my addiction. My values, my principles were to be a good husband, one who reciprocated his wife's love, and to be a good father, to care for and provide for my children, prepare them for life, love them, those different things. I was in emotional pain for my addiction because deep down I wanted to be the best father and the best husband I could be, and my addiction was an obstacle keeping me from doing that. Not only was it keeping me from doing that, eventually it would completely destroy my relationship with my wife. It's almost a certainty that we would have gotten a divorce, and then I would not be in my children's life as much. We all know how divorce in America doesn't usually work out well for the father in terms of access to his children. And the outcome of letting my addiction continue and letting the damage it was causing continue would be limited access to my children and limiting my ability to prepare them for life. And that is something I would never be able to recover from. So my emotional pain made me desperate, and it made me willing to go to meetings, even when I was tired and I didn't want to. It made me participate, made me get a sponsor, made me do the homework and work the steps, and bare my soul to strangers, which was pretty uncomfortable in the beginning, and piss in cups, and go to marriage counseling, and go to individual counseling, and be of service, and any and all the other things that comprise working the program. I remember that pain and the possible loss of my family, and that's what keeps me going to meetings. It's the fear of that pain returning, that fear of going back to living life as a slave. I'm desperate to avoid that pain and desperate to avoid that enslavement. So when my intensive outpatient program concluded, I was scared, and I was asking myself, can I keep this up on my own? Can I keep this up without being held accountable by a group every day and without being held accountable by peeing in a cup every day? Well, the answer was yes. I could keep it up on my own as long as I worked a program. So because I was in so much pain, when I got to IOP, I was brutally honest with myself, and I was all in, and I did all the things unhesitatingly that I needed to do to be successful. So I've seen people come to meetings, they relapse over and over, and sometimes they go to a higher level of care, or sometimes they just go out and they keep using. I suspect when that happens, it's because one or more of the following. Either they aren't desperate enough, meaning they haven't had enough pain yet, right? And sometimes you'll hear the old timers in the 12-step meetings, and you'll hear somebody who's fresh in the journey, and they pretend that maybe they don't have a problem, and they say things like that in the meetings. And sometimes you'll hear this hardcore old timer say, "Oh yeah, so you don't think you have a problem? All right, well, cool. Why don't you go try that out? Go try using, and then come back to me and let me know how that went." And that's the whole concept. There is they haven't had enough yet. The second possibility is they aren't being honest with themselves about their behavior, their motivation, what they really want, what failure is going to mean. And maybe the result of failure isn't bad enough or painful enough or scary enough to make a change. Or, like I said a moment ago, maybe they aren't being honest about the cost of continuing use and what that cost is going to be. I know that for me, as life changed, my priorities changed. It wasn't really important to me to become sober until my wife was pregnant with my daughter. And even then, it took me years to build up the strength to actually do it. But to be fair, I suspect the reason I didn't have any relapses and didn't need a higher level of care was because I'd already gotten all my relapses out of my system over 17 years. Like I said before, I'd relapsed probably hundreds of times. Hundreds for sure, if you count the times I couldn't make it an hour or 30 minutes or whatever. I almost died a couple of times, so by the time I got to IOP, I'd had enough. I was done. I was completely done with the suffering and the pain and all the consequences. And I was completely unwilling to ruin things with my wife and my kids by not cleaning up my own house, my own garden, if you will. So I had gotten all the relapses out of my system over the 17 years leading up to my recovery, and I was finally ready. And that's the thing, we all have different tolerance levels for pain, and we're all at various stages of being ready. The really sad thing, though, is that some people have such a high level of tolerance for emotional pain and physical pain that they don't stop using. They don't ever consider it, and they just die. And that's a really terrible thing because, they lose their life, and then obviously that creates a lot of pain for the people who cared about them, people who love them. So some of us have higher levels of tolerance for pain than others. I happen to have exceeded my tolerance level, so I was willing to do whatever it took, and here I am. Now, let's talk about urges and the addictive voice for a moment. So I'm about 40 months in, almost 3.5 years. It'll be 3.5 years here in December. So I get urges still. We all get urges. And that's why remembering how crappy and miserable life was pre-sobriety is important. And I think our brains are predisposed to forget pain. So the longer we go down the path of sobriety, the further away we get from the height of our addiction and the pain that was associated with it. And we have a tendency, I think, to forget how much pain we were in. I know this is true for women because otherwise they would never have more than one child. That's another reason continuing to go to meetings is important. As you progress in your journey, you become stronger, and you represent hope in those meetings to those starting out. You are that voice showing them that life does in fact get better. You're that example. And that they aren't alone, and that there are others out there who have gone through what they are going through and who can relate to it. In return, we get fresh pain. We see people who are starting their journey, and we're reminded of how desperate and scary and painful and lonely life was pre-sobriety. So don't be discouraged or hesitant to remind yourself of your lowest moments, whatever motivates you. Let me give you an example. Being a person with time at a meeting and offering support and insight is being of service. And fresh pain is one of those ways doing service work helps us. So at the end, my drug of choice was marijuana and alcohol. And I think what I'm about to share with you guys, I think I mentioned it in my story when I told that in those 2 episodes, but I'm going to get a little more granular about it here. And I'm going to talk about how I used this experience later on to avoid relapse. My drugs of choice were marijuana and alcohol. I would wake up in the morning and I'd start smoking within 5 minutes of getting out of bed. I would smoke on the way into the office. I would then go outside and get high at 10 a.m. Then at lunch, I would usually go to the bar. I would smoke a pipe in my car on the way there. I would have some shots of whiskey and tequila At that point, beer was a waste of time and effort. I would smoke the pipe on the way back to the office. Then I'd work a couple of hours, and I'd go back out to get high again at maybe 2:30 or 3 p.m. And then I would go home at 4 or 5 o'clock. When I started to get sober, my son was 4.5 maybe, and my daughter was 5.5. And for the last few years of my abuse, this is how it would go when I would get home from work. I would get home, and I would go straight into the bathroom. And this was after I'd give my wife and my kids a kiss and say hi. And I'd go straight to the bathroom after that, and I would start getting high. And I'd be in there ripping the bong. And what sucked was that my kids would be excited to see me. But I was so broken and so selfish that I couldn't stand to spend time with them until I got high. Getting high was more important than me spending time with them and showing them love and that they were important to me. So I'd be in the bathroom getting high, and I remember they would go and get like toys and stick them under the door, or they'd stick their little fingers under the door. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to communicate with me and entice me to come out and spend time with them. But I was so sick and so selfish and so broken that feeding my addiction was more important than going out there and spending time with them. So when I hear that addictive voice say, hey man, maybe now that you have 3.5 years of sober time, maybe now things are different. Maybe you can just have a single drink. Maybe you're cured. Maybe you can smoke weed once a month or twice a year, or smoke a joint or a bowl, or, whatever. Maybe you can eat some mushrooms. Who knows? And when I have the urge to use, which I still get from time to time, 40 months in, I remind myself of that memory of me hiding from my kids and taking their time with their father away from them because it was more important for me to get high. I am so revolted by that thought and so repulsed that it completely destroys the urge to get high. It completely silences the addictive voice. So the big book says that when we are desperate and are willing to do whatever it takes, and you put in the work, your higher power, in my case God, will remove your addiction. And you'll be revolted by and recoil from your drug of choice, and even thoughts of using your drug of choice, as if it were a hot flame. Now that's not word for word, that's not verbatim, but you get the general idea. So it reminds me of a story I used to tell when I worked with college students in a previous life. And the story goes like this. So there's a holy man, and this is back during the Roman Empire. And this holy man lives outside of the town, a couple of miles away on foot, out in the country. And he goes into town. One of the townspeople will provide him lodging, and then the next day he'll preach in the marketplace. And after he preaches that day, he goes back to his home outside of the town for a day or two, and then he'll return a couple of days later. So one day, he leaves his home late in the afternoon, and by the time he gets to the gates of the town, it's dark. So it's dark, and he's approaching the town, and he hears a voice out of the darkness say, "Who are you, and why are you here?" And it's the guard who stands at the gate at night. And what the guard does is he checks everyone out, and he makes sure that thieves and bandits and other undesirable folk don't get into town. So the holy man tells him, "It's me, the holy man. I'm here to stay with such and such town person, and I'm going to have dinner with them, and then I'll be speaking the word of God in the marketplace tomorrow." So the guard, he's satisfied. This is an okay guy. He lets the guy in, and everything proceeds as normal. The holy man goes about his business. He preaches the next day, and then he leaves town. A few days later, he returns. It's dark in the evening, and the guard asks him again, "Who are you and why are you here?" The holy man responds, "It is I, the holy man. I'm here to stay with such and such town person, and I'll be speaking the word of God in the marketplace tomorrow." The next afternoon, the holy man is leaving, and he gets to the gate, and he stops and asks the guard, "How much do they pay you to stand there and ask everyone who's coming, 'Who are you and why are you here?'" The guard replies, "I get paid 10 gold pieces a week." The holy man says, "I'll pay you twice that. I'll pay you 20 gold pieces a week to come and stand at the door of my home and ask me, who are you and why are you here? Every time I come home and every time I leave. Now, why would the holy man be willing to double this guy's pay? Personally, I think the reason he'd be willing to pay him twice his current salary is directly tied to motivation. See, motivation is a very powerful thing. Everybody has something they either want to acquire, or they have something that they already have, they've already attained it, and they want to keep it. In the holy man's case, he wants to share the word of God in hopes of inspiring new followers and ideally improving the world. In my case, as it relates to work, I'm there to reach out to companies and find deals and close those deals, generate revenue for my company, with the ultimate goal being to support my wife and kids. As a father, I want to teach and nurture my children. I want to prepare them for this world, instill qualities in them that will serve them well throughout the rest of their life. One day I won't be here anymore. As a husband, I want to nurture and grow the relationship with my wife and share this amazing adventure that I've got with her. For a caveman hunting the woolly mammoth, he wants to feed his caveman wife and caveman children. He wants to feed them delicious furred elephant meat. And that's the real trick of life and the tasks that are associated with living life. They're not going to be pleasant all the time. They're not always going to be comfortable. And when that happens, when things aren't comfortable, and that means you have to do things that are sometimes unpleasant in order to be successful. When you're faced with these unpleasant tasks, asking yourself that question, who are you and why are you here? And then responding internally, that galvanizes your resolve to accomplish your goal, because it reminds you of your motivation, right? So ask yourself that question from time to time. Remind yourself of your goals and motivation as it relates to the current task. Then ask yourself, is my current behavior consistent with my stated goals, objectives, and motivation? In other words, is your behavior consistent with your values and principles? Or are you saying one thing and then doing another? So throughout the day, I ask that question to myself, I listen to how I answer it, and I make sure my behavior is consistent with that answer. And at a certain level, that's what being successful is all about. Doing things that may be unpleasant, that they may be uncomfortable, things that you might not want to do in order to accomplish your goals. Now, this concept can apply to many different things. It can apply to work, it can apply to school, relationships, exercise, and health. If you're an athlete, it can apply to practicing. It can apply to addiction. For me, the ironic thing about this story, who are you and why are you here, is that this was something that I shared with students for years, college students, when they would start their academic programs. And I would share this story with them in an effort to motivate them to go out there and achieve their academic goals. And it's also a concept that I applied to myself in an academic environment and also in my career for years and years. But like I said, the odd and ironic thing is I never applied it to my addiction until relatively late in the game. Finally, when I asked myself, who are you and why are you here, regarding my family life with my wife and children, and then I answered that question, I'm a father and a husband, and I'm here to be the best father and husband I can possibly be for my family. When I assessed my behavior in relation to that answer, that was the tipping point. That was when I realized and acknowledged that what I was doing was not in alignment with my values and principles of being a good father and a good husband. And I realized my goals and motivations as it related to my family. And I realized I wasn't living up to being the husband and father that I was able to be because of my addiction. It was standing between me and my goal. And in that moment, I had clarity. My addiction had to go. So I'll leave you guys with this. Ask yourself frequently, who are you and why are you here? Ask yourself that question in relation to the various roles you fill in your life, and make sure there is consistency between your answers and your behavior. If you have feedback, comments, topics you'd like me to discuss, questions, anything, hit me at selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. If this was helpful, please rate it, review it, share it. That is all Louie's got for this evening. And and I wish everyone out there the best. Take care of yourselves. Who are you and why are you here?